The morning of the Whitmore Winter Assembly was the coldest Dorset had seen in 7 years, and the stone steps of St. Bride's Church were glazed with a thin, treacherous frost that the sexton had not yet thought to salt. Nell Ashby had arrived early, as was her habit, to assist in the arrangement of the charitable baskets that the parish ladies compiled each December for distribution after morning service. She carried 2 baskets, one on each arm, their handles cutting into her wrists through her thin woolen gloves, and she was concentrating on keeping her footing on the steps when she saw the girl. The child sat at the far corner of the church portico, pulled tight against the stone wall, as though the wall itself might offer warmth it did not have. She was perhaps 9 years old, dressed in a coat that had been mended so many times. The original color was impossible to determine, and she held something in her closed fist with the particular stillness of a person who has learned not to draw attention to anything they value. Her eyes were fixed on the street below in the watchful, patient manner of someone accustomed to waiting without knowing what she was waiting for. Nell set one basket down, crouched, and spoke quietly. "You will freeze here," she said. "Ah!" "Come inside." The child looked at her without moving. "I am not a beggar," the girl said. Her voice was steady and older than her years. "I did not say you were," Nell said. "Only that you will freeze. Come in. I have bread in this basket, and there is a fire in the vestibule." It was as she helped the child to her feet that Nell saw it, lying half hidden in the fold of the girl's coat, where it had slipped from that clenched fist a ring. Heavy gold, deeply engraved with a device Nell recognized at once, because she had grown up near enough to the great families of this county to know their emblems on sight. A tree stripped of leaves, 3 stars above it. The crest of the Barons Fenwick of Aldercroft. She said nothing about the ring. Inbleck. She brought the child inside and gave her bread and tea from the vestibule samovar, and sat beside her on the cold bench while the girl ate, and when the child had finished eating, she did not ask where the ring had come from. She only asked if there was someone waiting for her at home. The girl shook her head. That was where Lord Fenwick found them, his ward, whom his steward had spent 4 frantic days searching for, sitting quietly beside a woman he had never seen before. The color returning to the child's face, the bread finished, the girl asleep against a stranger's shoulder. He stopped in the doorway. The cold light fell across both of them. He stood very still, and whatever he felt in that moment, standing in the doorway of St. Bride's Church, on the coldest morning in 7 years, he did not show it. His face was composed, his hands were still at his sides, only the quality of his attention changed, a concentrated, unmoving focus that Nell did not see because her eyes were on the sleeping child. To the parish of Fenwick Halt, Nell Ashby was simply the schoolmaster's daughter. That was the whole of her, in the collective judgment of those who had known her father, and found little occasion to revise their assessment of his progeny after his death. The schoolmaster's daughter, with her mended gloves and her charitable baskets, and her quiet refusal to vacate her father's small cottage, despite the very sensible opinion of several prominent families that she ought to have found a situation by now. She was 23 years old, and had been managing alone for 18 months. She did not look up when the heavy door opened. She felt the cold enter before she heard the footstep, and even then she thought it was the sexton returning, until the silence following the footstep had a particular quality to it, weighted and attentive, and she raised her eyes. The man in the doorway was tall and dark-coated, with the kind of stillness that is not ease but discipline, the difference visible in the slight tension held across his shoulders. He was perhaps 32. His face was what her father would have called an ungenerous face, meaning not that it was unkind, but that it gave nothing away without cost. The jaw set, the gray eyes level and assessing. He wore no expression she could name. He was looking at the child. "She is sleeping," Nell said, keeping her voice low. "She was very cold. I think she has not eaten since yesterday." He stepped inside. He closed the door behind him with careful quietness. "You found her here," he said. His voice was low. The words were level. "On the steps A quarter of an hour ago. He moved to the bench and crouched as Nell had crouched on the steps, bringing himself to the child's eye level, though the child's eyes were closed. Something changed in his face. Not a softening, precisely, but a loosening of the discipline held there. A brief crack in the careful composure, visible only because Nell was close enough to see it, and because it passed so quickly. "Clara," he said very quietly. The girl stirred. Her eyes opened, found him, and she said, "My lord," in a voice still thick with sleep. "I know," he said. "I know. We will go home now." He looked up at Nell, then across the child's head. "You are Miss Ashby," he said. It was not a question. She was surprised that he knew her name. She did not let it show. "Yes, my lord. I am Fenwick," he said. "I owe you a considerable debt, Miss Ashby." "You owe me nothing," she said. She needed bread and warmth. It costs very little to provide bread and warmth. He looked at her for a moment in that level-assessing way as though she had said something worth considering. "Nevertheless," he said. He lifted Clara from the bench with a steadiness that surprised Nell, the child settling against his shoulder without waking again, and he carried her out into the frost. The ring, Nell noticed, was back in the child's closed fist. If you find yourself moved by a quiet act of grace, stay a little longer with this story. It will repay the time. The question of what to do with Lord Fenwick's debt occupied Nell for approximately 1 day before she set it aside. She had not helped the child to acquire a debt. She had helped her because Clara had been cold and alone on the church steps, and no other reason was required. The Baron's gratitude was a social artifact she had not sought and did not know what to do with, and she did not think about it again until the second morning after the assembly, when his card was brought to her cottage door by a footman in Aldercroft livery. The card requested, with formal courtesy, that Miss Ashby call at Aldercroft House at her convenience to discuss a matter of potential benefit to both parties. The phrasing was careful and committed to nothing. Nell read it twice, standing in the cold of her front doorway, and then she thanked the footman and told him she would call on the following Thursday. She had not been to Aldercroft House since she was a child, and her father had briefly served as tutor to the previous baron's youngest sons. She remembered it as a large, cold, gray stone place set back from the road on its own grounds, with the particular quality of great houses that have had their warmth removed by successive generations of careful management. Her father had called it a house that had forgotten how to be lived in. It had not changed much. The stone was the same gray stone, and the grounds were the same formal grounds, still and frost-covered now in December. The footman who admitted her led her through 2 rooms she recognized, a high entrance hall and a corridor lined with oil paintings, before showing her into a smaller room at the back of the house, a study, with bookshelves from floor to ceiling, and a fire that had been properly attended. Lord Fenwick was standing at the window when she entered, looking out at the frost-stiffened garden. He turned when she came in and said, "Miss Ashby, thank you for coming," and gestured to the chair beside the fire. She sat. He remained standing, which was not good manners, but she suspected it was not rudeness either. It was a man who thought more clearly on his feet. "I will come to the point," he said. "Since I do not think you are a person who benefits from excessive preamble." "I am not," she said. Something shifted briefly at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I have a ward," he said. "Clara Fenn. You have met her. She is the orphan daughter of my late cousin, and she has been in my guardianship for 11 months. In those 11 months she has resisted the efforts of 3 governesses, dismissed 2 of them herself in ways that I am told were rather final, and escaped the 3rd on 2 separate occasions, of which last Thursday was the 2nd. She did not seem ungovernable," Nell said. "She seemed very self-sufficient." "Yes," he said. "That is the precise problem. She is 9 years old, and she has decided she does not require management." He paused. "I am told she took the family signet ring from my desk 3 weeks ago. She said she had found it on the floor. This was not true, but I could not prove otherwise." "Why did she take it?" He looked at her. The gray eyes held a question she had not expected. "She said," he replied carefully, "that she was keeping it safe for me." Nell was quiet for a moment, considering this. She was not wrong. she said at last. To judge by where she ended up with it. He was very still for a moment. No, he said. She was not wrong. The proposition he then laid before her was simple. Would Miss Ashby consider a position at Aldercroft, not as a governess in the formal sense, which Clara had made abundantly clear she would not accept, but as a companion and instructor responsible for the girl's education and daily supervision, with terms to be agreed upon and reviewed at 3 months? The position would include accommodation in the East Wing, full board, and a salary that he named, with the directness of a man who considered evasion about money to be a kind of discourtesy. The salary was more than she had expected. Not ostentatiously so, but enough that she understood he had inquired into her circumstances before making the offer. She should have found that presumptuous. She was not sure she did. I will need to consider it, she said. Of course, he said. She returned home and considered it for 2 days, then sent her acceptance by the same footman who had delivered the card. She told herself she accepted because the salary was fair and the work was honest, and she was practical enough to recognize that the cottage and her small inheritance would not sustain her indefinitely. She did not examine any other reason too closely. Aldercroft House was cold in its public rooms and warm in its private ones, and this, Nell came to understand, was not an architectural accident, but a kind of map of how the household worked. The great rooms, the drawing room and the dining room and the entrance hall were maintained in a state of formal chilliness that served the house's public function. The rooms that were actually lived in, the breakfast room, the study, the East Wing sitting room where Clara had claimed her territory, were warm and lit and attended to. Clara received Nell's arrival with the careful neutrality of a child who has learned to withhold judgment until evidence warrants otherwise. You will try to make me do lessons, Clara said on the first morning, sitting cross-legged on the window seat with a book she was not reading. I will offer you lessons, Nell said. Whether you do them is a separate question. Clara looked at her. The last one said I had to do them, or she would tell my guardian. That sounds exhausting for everyone, Nell said. Clara's expression shifted, barely perceptibly. It was. By the second week, they had established a routine. Clara did lessons for the first 2 hours of the morning, mathematics and natural philosophy, and reading aloud. And for the rest of the day she was free to move about the house as she pleased within the limits Nell set, and enforced quietly and without drama. Clara tested the limits twice in the first week. She did not test them a third time. Lord Fenwick was present in the house as he lived there, but largely absent from their days. He breakfasted early and spent his mornings in the study, or out on the estate. He dined at 7 and was often still in the dining room when Nell brought Clara down for her evening visit, a practice that had apparently been Clara's own invention and that the Baron had not rescinded. On these occasions he spoke to the child directly and listened to her with attention, and spoke to Nell with the same formal courtesy he had used in their first meeting. He did not speak to her as though she were a servant. This was more notable than it should have been. She observed him in the way one observes a person one shares a house with, but does not yet understand. He was careful in all things. His speech was measured and his movements were deliberate, and he was, she thought, a person who had learned to hold himself very still as a way of holding the world at a manageable distance. What had produced that stillness, she could not yet see. She saw that Clara watched him with a protective attention that the girl was too young to name and too perceptive to suppress entirely. She saw that he carried in the breast pocket of his morning coat a miniature in a worn silver frame, which she glimpsed once when he reached for a letter on his desk and the coat fell open. He closed it again so quickly that she was not certain she had seen what she had seen. What she had seen was a woman's face, small and dark-haired and serious, painted in the manner of a decade past. She did not ask. The Christmas assembly at the Whitmore Rooms was, by the collective assessment of Dorset society, the most important social event of the county's winter season, and it was attended by anyone of consequence within a half-day's ride. Lady Thornton, who had organized it for 31 consecutive years, was known to compile the guest list with the careful precision of a general deploying troops, and the seating arrangements for the supper were discussed for weeks in drawing rooms throughout the county. Nell was not on the list. This was not unexpected. She had attended the assembly in previous years as her father's daughter, when her father's position as schoolmaster had given them a peripheral standing in the local social world. Since his death, that standing had evaporated with the certainty of morning frost. She was, as Mrs. Prentice of the parish committee had once observed to her daughter within Nell's hearing, the schoolmaster's daughter and no more, and could not be expected to maintain the connections her father's education had allowed. Nell had been 17 when she had overheard this. She had learned from it, as she learned from most things, to adjust her expectations to what the world was actually offering, rather than what she might have hoped it would offer. She attended the assembly, as it happened, because Lord Fenwick brought her. He had requested it, with the same quiet formality he used for everything, 3 days before the event. Clara was to attend, he said, as it was past time she was introduced to the local families, and he saw no reason why Miss Ashby should not accompany them. The request was practical in its framing. It did not ask for her comfort or her opinion on whether she wished to attend. It simply included her. She wore her second-best gown, the gray-green silk that had belonged to her mother, and that she had altered twice in the past 4 years as her figure changed. It was a good gown, still well made, and it showed its age only in the slight fading at the sleeve, which she had concealed by pressing the fabric carefully. She wore her mother's garnets, which were real and old and would survive any scrutiny. She was not vain about her appearance, but she was careful with what she had. The Whitmore rooms were fully lit when they arrived, the chandeliers blazing, the crowd already formed. Lady Thornton greeted Lord Fenwick at the door with the particular warmth reserved for titled guests, took his arm briefly, and then looked at Nell with a polished assessment that was entirely courteous and entirely dismissive. "Miss Ashby," she said, "how kind of you to come along." The phrasing was precise. Along. As though Nell were a piece of luggage that had accompanied the party. "Lady Thornton," Nell said, and smiled, with equal courtesy. Clara, standing between them, heard the exchange and pressed her lips together in the expression she made when she was composing a response she had decided not to deliver. Lord Fenwick did not hear it. He had been drawn aside by a gentleman who wished to speak to him about some matter of county business, and he was standing 3 feet away with his back toward them, answering questions in his measured, unhurried way. Nell steered Clara toward the far side of the room, and found her a chair near the windows. She meant that as an insult, Clara said. "Yes," Nell said. "Are you insulted?" "It would take more than Lady Thornton," Nell said, "to insult me against my will." Clara considered this with visible interest. The assembly wore on. Nell stayed near the windows with Clara, speaking to those who spoke to her, and not pursuing those who did not. She was accustomed to this management of the social perimeter. She had been practicing it since she was 17. She was aware of Lord Fenwick, moving through the room in the way one is aware of a shift in the quality of the air in a room, not directly observed but felt in the peripheral senses. A change in the arrangement of people around him that tracked his movement the way iron filings track a magnet. He was the most consequential man in the room. The room knew it, and adjusted itself accordingly. At 9:15, Miss Harriet Caldwell arrived. She was 21, the daughter of a wealthy land agent who had done well enough to have his daughter presented the previous season in London, and she had returned from that season with the particular confidence of a woman who has been told repeatedly that she is the most eligible girl in any room she enters. She was dressed in pale gold, her dark hair arranged with artful simplicity, and she moved across the floor with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has never had reason to doubt she would be looked at. She positioned herself near Lord Fenwick, within 10 minutes of her arrival. Nell noticed, because Clara noticed, and Clara's hand tightened slightly on Nell's arm. "Do not," Nell said quietly. Clara released her arm. "She is very pretty," Clara said after a moment, in a tone of voice that was not a compliment. "She is," Nell said. "Finish your lemonade." Lord Fenwick danced the first set, with Miss Caldwell. This was the event of the evening, to judge by the murmured commentary that ran through the supper-room, and Nell heard enough fragments of it to understand that the county had been waiting for some time for Lord Fenwick to demonstrate a preference, and had concluded, in the absence of evidence, that he would prefer Miss Caldwell. She watched them through one turn of the floor and then looked away, and found she was looking at the oil painting above the musician's dais, a landscape of the county in summer, the fields improbably green. The warmth of the room was beginning to feel like a pressure rather than a comfort. Clara had fallen asleep in her chair at 9:30, her head tipped against the wall, and this gave Nell an occupation and an excuse. She sat beside the sleeping child and kept her post until supper was announced, at which point she gently woke Clara and guided her toward the supper-room. Lord Fenwick appeared at her elbow before she had crossed the room. "She lasted longer than I expected," he said, looking at Clara. "She was determined," Nell said. "She has been looking forward to this for 2 weeks." "I know," he said. He offered Clara his arm for the walk to the supper-room, which Clara took with great seriousness. He did not offer Nell his arm. He did not need to. He simply walked beside her, and the distance between them was exactly the distance propriety required, and not an inch more. She was aware of the warmth of him. She was aware that her shoulder was very close to his arm. She was aware of none of this consciously, not in a way she permitted herself to examine. But her body registered it in the slight alteration of her breathing and the way her hand settled more carefully at her side. Miss Caldwell watched them cross the room, together with the particular expression of a woman recalibrating an assessment she had considered settled. In the supper-room, Lady Thornton arranged the seating with her customary authority, and Nell found herself placed at the far end of the table, between the vicar's wife and a retired major. She did not know. This was not an accident. Lady Thornton did not make accidental seating arrangements. She ate her supper and spoke to the vicar's wife about the parish school, and to the major about his time in the north, and she did not look toward the other end of the table, where Lord Fenwick sat between Lady Thornton herself and Miss Caldwell. Clara, seated between 2 of Lady Thornton's granddaughters, ate with methodical enthusiasm and ignored the girls on either side of her with cheerful completeness. The drive home was quiet. Clara slept across the carriage seat with her head in Nell's lap before they had reached the edge of the town, and Lord Fenwick sat opposite them in the darkness and looked out the window at the frost-bright road. After some minutes he said, without turning from the window, "Lady Thornton placed you at the far end of the table." "Yes," Nell said. "That was deliberate." "Yes," she said again. "I should have reviewed the arrangement." She looked at the top of Clara's sleeping head. "It was not your responsibility to review it." He was quiet again. The carriage moved through the cold. After a moment he said, "It was in my house. It was my responsibility." She did not answer. When they arrived at Aldercroft and Clara had been carried inside and settled, Nell returned to her own room and sat for a while in the chair beside the window, looking out at the frost-glazed grounds. She had been placed at the far end of supper tables before, and she would be placed there again, and she had long since learned a certain peace in not requiring the approval of people whose approval she could not trust to be worth having. What she could not quite place was the warmth of the carriage ride home, and the quality of his voice when he said it was his responsibility, and the fact that his face, in the darkness, had looked for a moment not like the composed and measured face he presented to the world, but like something underneath that face, something that was not composed at all. She told herself this was not a thing she was permitted to think about, and she told herself this several times before she slept. Some things, once noticed, cannot be unnoticed. This is a thing the heart understands long before the mind consents to. 3 weeks into January, Clara came to Nell's sitting room at an hour when she was not expected, without knocking, which was unusual, and sat down in the opposite chair without being invited, which was not unusual at all. "My lord was in his study last night," Clara said, "after midnight." "Many people are in their studies after midnight," Nell said. "It is a respectable thing to be." "He was not working," Clara said. "He was sitting at his desk, not doing anything." Nell looked up from the letter she was writing. "I could not sleep," Clara said. in the voice of someone prepared to defend themselves. And I could see the light under his door. Clara, I did not go in. I only heard. She paused. He was talking very quietly to someone who was not there. Nell put down her pen. The child's face was carefully composed in the way it got when she was conveying something that mattered to her, the jaw set, the eyes direct. He does that sometimes, Clara said. I have heard it before. When he thinks the house is asleep. There was a period of silence. He had a wife, Clara said. Margaret. She died when I was 4. My mother told me before she died. She said he had loved her very much, and that after she was gone he could not be the same. She said, Clara continued, that he put her portrait away because he could not look at it, and could not bear not to look at it. Nell thought of the miniature she had glimpsed in his breast pocket. He carries it with him, she said, before she had decided to say it. Clara looked at her. You saw it once. By accident. The girl was quiet for a moment. She died in childbed, Clara said. My mother said the child was lost too. He had no children after that, only the estate. The word came out of her with an old gravity. And now you, Nell said. Clara glanced at her, a quick, unguarded look. He did not ask for me, she said. My parents were dead, and I had no one else. No, Nell said. And yet, here you are. Clara sat with this for a moment. Then she said, he looked at you differently. At the assembly. Nell kept her expression level. How do you mean? Not like he looks at Lady Thornton or Miss Caldwell, Clara said with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to dress a difficult observation in softer clothing. Like he was paying attention to where you were in the room. I am responsible for your safety. He is likely tracking both of us. No, Clara said with complete certainty. It was only you. She stood up then, as if the matter were settled, and left the room. Nell sat for a long time with her half-finished letter, and the cold morning light coming through the window and the sound of the house around her settling in quiet. She knew by now the shape of her own feelings. She was not a woman who deceived herself about inconvenient things, even when she very much wished to. She had recognized the pull of him in stages, the careful attention, the directness of his speech, the crack in his composure on the bench in the vestibule when he had said Clara's name, the quality of the carriage ride home. And now this, the worn miniature in his breast pocket and the wife he still spoke to at midnight. And all of it added up to a man who was present in her world, in a way she could not manage, by simply declining to think about it. She was the schoolmaster's daughter, and he was Baron Fenwick of Aldercroft, and the distance between those two positions was not a distance that collapsed, simply because two people occupied the same house and one of them carried a grief that the other recognized by its shape. She finished her letter. She went to find Clara. By February, the county had decided what it thought. It thought, primarily, that Lord Fenwick was conducting his affairs with a want of proper attention. The assembly season was proceeding without any sign that he intended to make a declaration to Miss Caldwell, and this was considered by those who considered such things to be an oversight that reflected poorly on both his social judgment and his household management. It was also noted, and noted with more pointed commentary, that his ward's companion was a person whose presence at Aldercroft was not precisely irregular, but was certainly unusual. A young woman of no fortune and no consequence, the schoolmaster's daughter. Mrs. Prentice, who had spent 30 years arriving at opinions before others had finished forming theirs, said to Lady Thornton over tea that the arrangement was a thing that required, at the very least, a clearer explanation than had been offered. Lady Thornton agreed with the measured certainty of a woman who intended to act on the agreement. The explanation came to Nell by way of Mrs. Dinty. Farrow, the housekeeper, who knocked at her sitting-room door one evening in February, with an expression that combined sincere personal sympathy with a reluctant delivery of institutional news. Lady Thornton has called this afternoon, Mrs. Farrow said. I thought you ought to know, Miss Ashby, that she spoke with his lordship for some time in the drawing-room. Yes, Nell said. I did not listen at the door, Mrs. Bottom. Pharaoh said, which was as good as a confirmation that the door had been imperfectly closed, and that Mrs. Pharaoh had been passing in the vicinity at some relevant moment. Only, she mentioned your name several times. Nell thanked her and said good evening, and sat for a long time after she had gone watching the fire settle. She learned the rest from Clara, who had learned it from the footman who had been present to serve the tea. Lady Thornton had come to make a case. She had done so by all accounts with great civility and very little concealment. She had expressed the county's collective concern that Lord Fenwick's continued failure to pursue an eligible match was creating unnecessary uncertainty in local society. She had named Miss Caldwell as the appropriate resolution. She had then noted, with the particular delicacy of a woman who considers herself to be doing a kindness, that the presence of a young woman of Miss Ashby's station in the household created an impression that was, however unintentionally, not wholly to his lordship's credit. Lord Fenwick had, according to the footman, listened to all of this without interrupting. He had then, very politely, shown Lady Thornton out. That was a Wednesday. On Friday he asked to speak to Nell in the study. She went with her hands quiet at her sides, and her face as composed as she could make it. He was standing at the window again as he had been that first morning, looking out at the grounds. He turned when she entered. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You do not," she said. "What passes in the drawing-room is your affair, my lord. Lady Thornton came to inform me that your presence here is damaging to my reputation," he said, with the measured flatness of a man repeating words he finds absurd, "and to recommend, for the good of the county, that I resolve the matter by marrying Miss Caldwell." Nell said nothing. "She described you," he said, "as a person of no account who cannot be expected to maintain the standards of this household." The phrase landed in the room between them. "It is a tolerably accurate description," Nell said, "of my social position." "It is not accurate," he said, "of you." She looked at him. "I want you to understand," he said carefully, "that Lady Thornton's visit changes nothing about this household or your position in it. If you are comfortable here and if Clara continues to progress as she has progressed, I see no reason to alter any arrangement." "You are very kind," she said. "I am not kind," he said. "I am stating a fact." She breathed in slowly. "My lord," she said, "I must be plain with you. I am grateful for this position. I am grateful for Clara, and for the house, and for the work. I would not have you preserve my position at cost to yourself. If the county believes my presence here is irregular, then we must consider whether that belief has consequences for you that outweigh the advantages of the current arrangement." He looked at her for a long moment. "The county's belief," he said, "has never governed my arrangements." She went away with that, and did not know what to do with it. What she did not yet know was that Lady Thornton had also that same Friday afternoon called on Miss Caldwell and had delivered a version of the county's collective assessment that was rather differently shaped than what she had delivered in Lord Fenwick's drawing-room. She had told Miss Caldwell that the situation at Aldercroft was one that a determined woman, properly advised, might turn to her own advantage. She had suggested that the spring assembly, now 6 weeks away, was an occasion that would benefit from a certain amount of preparation. Miss Caldwell listened with the focused attention of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this kind of advice. The spring assembly was held in March, when the frost had retreated but the evenings were still cold, in the full rooms of the Whitmore Assembly Hall. Lord Fenwick brought Clara and Nell as he had brought them in December in his own carriage, with the same formal quiet. Clara was wearing a new dress, pale blue wool with white trim, which she had accepted without resistance, and was wearing with evident satisfaction. She sat beside Nell in the carriage and described in detail the plans she intended to study when the grounds at Aldercroft thawed fully, and Lord Fenwick listened from the opposite seat with a particular expression he wore when Clara was talking, a quality of held attention that was as close to warmth as his face generally managed. The rooms were already full when they arrived. Nell saw Lady Thornton's gaze find them across the hall within the first minutes, travel over Clara, settle on Nell, and move on with the practiced neutrality of a woman executing a plan. Miss Caldwell arrived 20 minutes after them. She was wearing ice blue, which suited her very well, and she crossed the floor toward Lord Fenwick, with the directness of someone who has decided that the time for circumspect approaches has passed. She greeted him warmly. She acknowledged Clara with a gracious smile. She did not acknowledge Nell at all. Not a glance, not a nod, not the smallest social gesture of recognition. It was done with such complete smoothness that a person watching from a distance might not have noticed anything. Nell noticed because it was directed at her, and Clara noticed because Clara noticed everything. Clara's hand found Nell's arm. She did not say anything. She simply held on. Miss Caldwell began talking to Lord Fenwick about a matter of mutual social interest, and he answered her with his customary courtesy, and the room arranged itself around this focal point with the easy familiarity of a crowd that has been expecting this configuration. Lady Thornton appeared at Nell's elbow. "Miss Ashby," she said, "I wonder if I might speak plainly." "I imagine you will," Nell said, "regardless of whether I wonder." Lady Thornton's expression flickered, infinitesimally. "You are an intelligent woman," she said, which was not a compliment in her voice. "You must see that your position at Aldercroft is not, and cannot be, what Lord Fenwick requires for his household's future. He will marry. He must marry, for the estate and for that child's proper establishment, when he does. A companion of your, shall we say, informal standing will not find herself retained." "I am aware of these realities, Lady Thornton," Nell said. "Then you will understand," Lady Thornton said, "that the kindest course for all concerned is for you to seek a situation elsewhere before the matter is resolved for you. I could recommend you warmly to several families in the north who require exactly your kind of sensible management. It would be a clean resolution. No one would need to be distressed." She said it with the particular gentle confidence of a woman who has never once had her arrangements refused, who has smoothed over inconvenient people for so many years that the smoothing has become indistinguishable in her mind from charity. Nell looked at her. "Thank you, Lady Thornton," she said. "I will consider your recommendation carefully." She pressed Clara's hand. "Now, if you will excuse us, Clara would like lemonade." She steered them both away. Clara said nothing until they had reached the refreshment table. "She told you to leave," Clara said. "Yes," Nell said. "Are you going to?" Nell poured 2 glasses of lemonade. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. Clara turned to look at her very directly. "I want you to stay," she said. It was simply stated, with no adornment, in the manner of a child who has learned that the plainest expression of a thing is frequently the most effective. "I know," Nell said. "Drink your lemonade." What came next came later in the evening after supper, when the dancing had resumed and the room had settled into its comfortable post-supper warmth. Miss Caldwell positioned herself beside Lord Fenwick near the far wall, where the crowd was thinner, and said something to him that Nell could not hear. He answered briefly, and Miss Caldwell spoke again, and then said something in a lower register that carried a particular quality of deliberateness. Nell heard it because the music paused between sets, and the room's noise dropped for 3 seconds, and Miss Caldwell's voice, trained to carry in a drawing room, reached exactly far enough. "Your ward's companion," Miss Caldwell said, "is of course a perfectly adequate sort of person. But adequate, I think, is the ceiling of what one can expect of a schoolmaster's daughter." The words fell into the brief silence between the music and the crowd's resumed conversation. 2 people turned, then 4. Lord Fenwick went very still. It was the stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Not discipline, but something beneath discipline, a held quality that was neither composed nor managed, something that had been pressed for a long time and had just arrived at its limit. He turned from Miss Caldwell. He crossed the room. It was not a long crossing, perhaps 20 feet, through the assembled guests of the Whitmore Spring Assembly, and he did it without haste and without performance, as a man walks toward something he has decided to walk toward without qualification. The crowd saw him coming. The crowd parted, not dramatically, but with the quiet inevitability of people who understand that something is happening. He stopped in front of Nell. He did not look at anyone else. He did not look at Miss Caldwell or Lady Thornton or the assembled witnesses. He looked at Nell with those gray, level eyes, and the expression in them was the one she had seen once in the vestibule of St. Bride's Church, when he had crouched beside his sleeping ward, and his face had briefly been the face underneath the face. He held out his hand. "The room was very quiet, Nell," he said. "Will you stand with me? Not a question, but not a command." A thing offered. With everything he had, in 12 words, in front of everyone who had ever thought she did not warrant counting. She looked at his hand. Her whole body understood what her mind had known for weeks and had declined to acknowledge: the pull of him, the quality of his attention, the shape of his grief, and the specific cost of what he was doing in this room, in front of these people, at this moment. She placed her hand in his. Clara, standing 6 feet away, made a small sound that was not quite crying, and very nearly was. He did not speak again. He did not need to. The room had heard 12 words, and would reconstruct the rest with perfect accuracy, without any assistance from him. Lady Thornton's fan, half raised, did not complete its arc. She stilled. She looked at Nell, and for just one moment, something in her expression that had been very certain became less so. Miss Caldwell said nothing. She had the grace, or perhaps only the intelligence, to understand that there was nothing to say. The solicitor, Mr. Briggs, who happened to be among the assembly guests, witnessed the moment from near the windows, and afterwards said that he had rarely seen a thing done more plainly and more completely. Lord Fenwick led Nell to the edge of the floor. They stood there together while the music started again, his hand still around hers. The room beginning to settle around what had happened, the way rooms settle around all inevitable things, not accepting exactly, but adjusting. "You should know," he said, his voice very low, "that I intend to speak to you properly. Not here. Tomorrow, in the morning, in the study. But I did not want to say nothing here." "You said enough," she said. "Not nearly," he said. Then, after a moment, he said, "I have not asked anyone anything since Margaret. I had not thought I would." She held his hand carefully in hers. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You do not have to give me an answer tonight." "I am not," she said, going to say no. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not yet, but the precursor to something that might become one. The faintest lessening of the long-held discipline. A breath let out that had been held for much longer than this evening. Clara appeared at Nell's other side, inserted herself between them with complete confidence, and took Nell's free hand in both of hers. "Good," she said. She said it with the finality of a person who has been managing a situation for some time and is pleased to see it resolve in the direction she intended. The ring in her pocket, the heavy gold signet she had carried for 3 months on the church steps, and in the cold vestibule and in her coat, all the long weeks since, pressed warmly against her palm. The drive home was quiet. Clara slept against Nell's shoulder before they had cleared the edge of the town as she had in December, and the carriage moved through the March darkness with the cold held outside the glass, and Lord Fenwick sat opposite them as he had sat then, but this time he was not looking out the window. He was looking at Nell. When she met his gaze, he did not look away. March softened into April at Aldercroft, and the grounds came back to themselves, the frost releasing the grass, the formal beds beginning their slow recovery, and Clara took to spending whole afternoons in the kitchen garden with the undergardener, cataloguing every plant she found with the systematic thoroughness of a natural philosopher in miniature. Lord Fenwick spoke to Nell in the study on the morning after the assembly, as he had promised, in the careful, formal manner of a man who is entirely certain of what he wishes to say and is taking the time to say it correctly. He named what he felt with the same directness he used for everything. And what he felt was not the comfortable thing, not the convenient thing, not the politic thing. It was specific, and it was earned, and it was hers if she would have it. She said yes. She said it simply because she was a person who did not embellish the important things, and because she had been certain for weeks and saw no need to pretend otherwise. Mr. Gedd. Briggs came to Aldercroft in the second week of April and spent an afternoon in the study with Lord Fenwick. And when he left, he took with him a document that would, within the appropriate legal period, establish the matter in the manner these things required. On the evening of the day Mr. Blanks Briggs departed, Lord Fenwick came to find Nell in the east wing sitting room, where she was reading beside the fire, and he sat in the opposite chair, and they remained there for some time without speaking, because some rooms have enough warmth already. Clara came in at 8:30, as was her custom, ate half of a biscuit from the tray on the side table, and sat on the hearthrug and read her own book. And the fire settled, and the evening came down over the grounds and over the county and over the comfortable, particular quiet of a house that has remembered how to be lived in. She had the signet ring, clean and polished now, in the small wooden box on her window-sill where she had placed it the night of the assembly, when she had finally thought it safe to relinquish. She looked at it sometimes. In the morning before the household woke, it had kept him safe. He told her much later, sitting at the breakfast table on a morning in late spring with Clara nearby, and the garden full of the sounds of the grounds coming fully into themselves, that the ring had belonged to his father and to his father's father, and had always been kept in the study on the desk, in the particular way things are kept when they are expected to outlast everything. "I did not know Clara had taken it until it came back," he said. "Did you know where it had been?" Nell asked. He looked at her. "No," he said. "I only knew it came back whole." She poured his coffee. The morning light came through the windows and fell across the table and across her hands and across the face of a man who had learned at some considerable cost that the world occasionally returns the things it borrows. If you found your way to the end of this story, thank you for spending these quiet minutes here. Leave a word in the comment if something in it stayed with you. The signet ring sat in its box on the windowsill all that spring, and caught the light each morning, and waited for nothing.